Thank you so much, Russell. Thank you to everyone at LITLIT and Hauser Wirth, and good morning to my esteemed colleagues, Dagny, Paul, and Michaela. Let's begin this conversation talking about the nature of art and artist books. As you may know, I'm an artist who has a small publishing house, Sex Artist Books, and our focus is on this type of work. How would you describe to someone who doesn't know what this category is, what an artist book is? Is it something that's a book about a work of art, or is it an artwork that is a book?
I actually am pretty opinionated about that.
That's what I was hoping.
I think that just because an artist is affiliated with the production of a book, that it doesn't necessarily make that an artist book. I feel strongly that an artist book is a work of art, and it's a kind of translation of something that happens to an artist that is brought to me, to the reader, and it has to come squarely from the artist to me. The work of art has to come that direction, kind of Lucky Pierre style. The artist brings me the work of art, and it comes here to my heart.
Paul, what do you think about that? How do literature, bookmaking, and writing fit into your practice?
Oh, you need
your microphone.
What was the question?
Well, there were a couple of questions in there.
What's an artist book?
To you, and how does it fit into your...
In response, yeah. For me, it's a more broad definition. Just in art today, whether an artist touches an object in the making, I mean, there are artists, you have an idea, you have a concept, and somebody else carries it out. And then it gets into some form of collaboration. And that puts into question the whole idea of the hand of the artist and the importance of that. And I think it applies to books too. So, and then on the other side to that, you have, maybe there's an objective definition of what an artist book is, or meaning a social, objective idea of an artist book. And then for me, there's a subjective one. I've always thought of, and it's a very weird perception that I can't explain, I've always thought of all my work as one big book. And it literally is, in my brain, a book. So that forms another idea of what an artist's book might be. From a subjective point of view, it's the entire body of work, and I just see it as a book. Actually, and I think that's kind of related to some sort of indoctrination or conditioning of why I, and then of course if you see an entire body of work as a book, then why not an entire life?
Actually, to be nice and specific, the Library of Congress only recognized the category artist books in 1980. Prior to that, we had Livre de Luxe, we had a whole other kind of categorization, but we had lots of sort of disruptions of that idea with the Fluxus artists, of course, and with the futurists, Marinetti. You actually got, I think, some big inspiration from Debord and the Memoirs book. So those early manifestos, maybe Tristan Tzara and Apollinaire, who used typography, can we call those artist books, or were they just, what were they? Since they didn't have the definition before 1980.
Michaela, what do you think?
Well, I basically, I have difficulty with categories. I know what Paul's artist books are. They don't fit in the shelf. You can't mail them around. We have here a wonderful example of your latest artist book you made on Caribbean pirates. It's a book you can't basically handle. You can't read the text. You need to find a completely different approach. I'm working in different areas. For Hauser Wirth publishers, we do exhibition catalogues, we publish artist writings, artist books. So every title is for me an own universe, some way.
One of the things you did, Alexandra, which I think is very important, is your illustrations to the book with Keanu. I find that that artists are very, that illustrations can change the meaning of a text, and they're like translations of a text. So it goes through another person. How do you think about that?
Thank you for the question. I had a rule when I was a younger artist that I would never illustrate anything, that my work was always going to be about the words themselves being the objects, the paintings, and I had this giant judgment against illustration. So, and against interpretation of text in that way. I wanted to present the text as a literal thing. And so Ode to Happiness was I broke a huge internal rule of my own. So it was, in a way, a very basic thing to do, which was to illustrate. But it was to allow interpretation for me, and that seemed to be really radical. And I actually, for me, but I really like what you said, Paul, about the idea of the social function of the book. And what the illustration allowed was for the work to function socially in a different way than any work I'd ever made. And I see the books I had an extraordinary experience with that book. Someone messaged me about it, and they said, I rented an Airbnb to commit suicide in. And I got there, and your artist book was sitting on the table. And I read it, and I decided not to kill myself. It's the most moving fan letter I've ever received. Wow. And I thought, but isn't that so extraordinary? Because the last line is, it could always be worse. But I just like this idea that we're sending these messages in different forms, and that the books, not everyone can have a Paul McCarthy installation in their living room, but a book can reach out and fan out in a way that's this social function that it's very, very compelling, and it's so beyond what we do in institutions such as galleries and museums. And so I wondered if we could talk a little bit about its dissemination, its diffusion. It's not just distribution, it's something else.
I think that's what the futurists and what the Fluxus artists and the male artists were trying to do, precisely that, working around the commercial system, trying to get themselves out of the gallery. And most of the works were free. And actually, Richard Jackson did something really great. He made an artist book in the early 80s, and it was presented for sale at his show at the Menil later, and he wanted to have it given away. And of course, the institution said that was impossible. You can't just give away your artist book. And so they sold it. And at the end of the show, Richard inquired and asked for the names of the people who had bought this book from the bookstore. And when he received that information, he wrote to every single person that had bought his book and refunded their money, because he did not want it to be for sale.
So it's a different kind of exchange then.
Well, he essentially did not want to exchange his work of art for money.
I was going to say, I've made 2 or 3 of these big books, and I don't view them in a way as a book per se. Like for me, they're small sculptures that are cheap. They're just big books that are expensive. And it's just how you look at them. So they have there's a kind of stigma with them. Oh, it's too big a book. It's too expensive. And I look at it and go, dude, it's really a small sculpture and it's cheap, you know? And it also, the profit margin on something like this is zero. I mean, there's no money coming from this book. It can barely pay for itself. So in a way, and the amount of effort to make the book was a lot. And so it's very collaborative in making it. I made it with Louisa McCarthy, and we spent a long time doing it. So it's kind of, as a book, it gets a negative stigma, I think. Like, too big to fit on the shelf. Well, don't put it on the shelf, you know?
Of course, you're in the great tradition of books. I think it was probably Duchamp that started that idea of changing the object of a book into a sculptural object when he did the Bois d'Anvelies. I think that was started in 1942. And that was essentially because he couldn't figure out how to get his ideas into book format. So he just changed the format. And of course, Diderot did that like mad with the literature Kunst, what is it called, the literature sausage? That artist book, I guess, that took the form of a sausage. He used a normal sausage recipe, and all the herbs and all the spices that go into making a sausage were used. But then he took pages from a book and tore them up and mashed them into the gruel and made sausages out of them, and that was his art. That was his book. And that was done, I think, in about 1959 or something like that. So there's a tradition of moving the book into different formats.
And Paul, for sure, is in this tradition in decontextualizing and rediscussing on an abstract level also the content, the information you get through a book. I want to ask you, since you're rejecting the idea of the bookshelf, what is the ideal use, the ideal audience, or the approach to your books? So do you want them to be displayed? Do you use them as a sculpture in your space?
No, it doesn't need to be displayed like it is. I mean, I don't care about the display, and I don't. It's only a sculpture because I can think of it that way, and of course it's different than maybe the Diderot stuff or something that actually the book object is in question, like pages, square, whatever is in question. And a lot of artist books, I think, over the last 100 years have questioned the shape of a book. And this is, in a way, Paul, you're full of shit, it looks like a book. But it's still in my mind, it takes another, it's a way of, and even a book like this, it's expensive to make, so how many can you make? I think there's 1,000 of them, isn't it? It's like 1,000, I don't know how many. But I don't really mean that it should go on a pedestal, in fact, far from it. But I just think of it as an object that maybe can it can serve as something, as a work of art, or it can go into somebody's hands that way. And even though it's a book form, it's a book form.
One of my favorite non-book books that you did is the one with the Tide cover. Oh, remember that box?
The Tide box.
Yeah, that was a presentation of ideas, like a collage of images that you, I guess, looked around your studio and found, and then the book was inserted into this really unusual cover, which did serve as a kind of sculptural object.
You know, I'll just briefly, that book, the Tide book, is really, it's a kind of collection beginning with high school when I see a Henry Moore. And it goes all the way up to, I think the last image is Simone Forti. And it goes through a kind of somewhere between a chronology of what I remembered and what I'd collected from being around art history, being in art, and then, but not truly a chronology. It's intentionally disrupted. And then the Tide box itself has this crazy history where I used to work in a grocery store and I was really obsessed. I had to take care of the soap aisles, and it really smells like the soap aisle of Tide and all these things. And I was really fascinated with the Tide box, and I wanted to paint a painting when I was in high school of a Tide box. And then later on, there was a situation in which, what's her name? The porn star was on the cover of the Ivory Snow box. What? No. What? Yes. And at the same time she made the porn, she was on the cover of Ivory Snow holding a baby. And I had told, Karen and I kept it on our fridge for years, the box. And we had one, and then somebody stole it. So Jason Rhodes made a piece where he reprinted the box and gave it as a refrigerator magnet, but a big box. And so he'd kind of taken this thing that Karen and I had, reconfigured it into a box, put it on a fridge, as connection to the fridge. At the same time, I'm kind of dealing with this Tide box, and I decide to put the book inside a Tide box. So I reprinted the Tide box to put the book in. I didn't know later on, I can't remember, a year or so later, I find out the guy who designed the Tide box also designed the Ivory Snow box. So the two boxes got connected. So I'm sort of interested in doing another book with the Ivory Snow box. So, so it completes the circle.
But that actually goes to what I was trying to say in the beginning, where I like the idea of the artist's hand in the making of a book box object.
Yeah.
And
But
that
I didn't make the box.
I know, but you certainly, shall we say, were directly involved in it. And you did that with the Shit Plug too, didn't you?
Yeah.
That was another box collaboration that was kind of weird and interesting in that, as usual, and along the lines of the memoir, the Debord thing, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and Debord, by the way, with that book, it was the first book. Asker Jorn actually wanted to disrupt the idea of a nice, convenient book, like you do often, and therefore had this idea he was either going to have sticky asphalt for the cover, or he would have a rough sandpaper cover. And he chose the sandpaper because he knew it would wreck the tabletop, you know, or it would damage the books next to it on a shelf. And he wanted to be sure that the book was read. And then, of course, you see the Ed Ruscha book, or the Billy L. Bankston catalog from LACMA in 1968, has that same sandpaper cover. So I think that artists often like to not fit on a shelf too well.
You know, Jason and I also took the Guy Debord Askar book, and we reprinted the whole book, but stretched it really long. So with a computer, just stretch the contents. But then we tried to make sheets and pillowcases out of Guy Debord's Society of the Spectacle. Still a project. Somebody can do it.
But Alexandra, when you first, sorry, I have to ask you this, because when she first had this book, or this idea for the book, she came to me, and she told me this idea that she had decided to make this book, and you didn't, as an artist, you didn't have a publisher, you didn't have any financial means, you didn't have any real idea how to go about it, and now you not only somehow got the book published independently, you got it distributed perfectly, you now opened your own publishing house. So,
it's an addiction.
Yeah.
You make a book, and it becomes your starter drug. And then you just keep, I mean, there is a real pleasure of making one's own artist books, but I think that because the bookmaking process, as you've said, is so collaborative, there's a real joy of getting a team together, of working with a graphic designer, working, with the color correction, going on press, the smell of ink. I mean, it's not only a haptic experience to have the book in your hand or on your lap or scratching up your table, but for me, it's the joy of the collaboration of making the books. And I think often about the relationship between bookmaking and exhibition making, that sometimes exhibitions shouldn't be exhibitions, they should be books. And there's often books that become seeds or scores or scripts for real world experiences. And it's that role, that function of the book that's spatial, it's temporal, it's an archive inside of a life in the way that you were describing, Paul. So, Michaela, I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you conceive of books similarly or differently than, say, a gallery exhibition?
Well, my background is curating, and so I was trained. I worked in the Kunsthalle in Germany, doing exhibitions, and as a natural part of this process was also making books. But step by step, I moved into the realm of the book itself. And I think there is a lot in common, of course, because you are basically curating the content. With a book, you start basically with an infinite space. So it can be small. Recently, we did a really small book. I make a bit of publicity for that, just a new release. Conversations with Ursula Hauser, or you can go into thousands of pages. And I think the interesting part for me is really the very first conversations and the conceptual part. What is it, what we are looking at, what is this content, and to find the right form. And then to develop this in the sequence of a book. So a book urges us to think in a quite traditional linearity. I know, of course, where you can disrupt this narration. Most of the books we are doing try to keep a narration because we are in the service of the artist's work. So we want to inform, we want to give an insight into the dimensions of the artistic creativity. And we have texts we want the people to read. So it's a bit different from the classical artist book, where you have much more freedom. So I feel the limits also, because I think, yes, there is an audience and I have a service. And we are all working together, this teamwork I also very much appreciate. Because it's this starting a conversation, getting a feedback, revising your own ideas, and then this process to really develop the book, and in the end, eventually, having made the book the content needs, that's my biggest ambition.
Have you ever had the experience where the book deviates from the exhibition? that you've made an institutional book, for example, and it deviates in mission or message or mission from the actual exhibition. And because I think, one of the things that's extraordinary about making art books is that they're so expensive in time and energy, and I've never, being a fussy control freak person myself, I've never met groups of people who are so obsessed with details as bookmaking. And so I'm wondering if you could, it's a kind of social exchange, the behind the scenes, right, of bookmaking. So have you had the experience of having a different message or?
Well, what I noticed, so we have different, let's say, buckets. So one bucket is the exhibition catalog, which, is born or grown from the desire to give a document of what this exhibition is, of what this grouping of works is. So the freedom to do something completely different is limited, but it happens often that we decide not to do an exhibition catalog, but to develop something which is way beyond this specific moment of showing work in a specific place. Since we see the book really as something which has a longer life, it should be something which really gives or adds something to the bibliography to an artist, and should tell the story for the next 10, 20, 30 years.
And it lasts longer, the book lasts longer than the exhibition. So how do you think about that lifetime of a book in terms of your exhibitions that you've curated or created?
Well, sometimes the exhibition catalog is the only evidence of the show. And sometimes the exhibition catalog, just what Ursula was saying, might include something that was expected to be in the show that doesn't actually appear in the show. That happens all the time. And have you had more and more artists asking you to publish artist books and not exhibition catalogs, so to speak, when you do a show?
It's not that there is this request, I want an artist book. I think it's more to really look at what is there. What is there a body of work which is now interesting to bring into the form of a book, and what is the appropriate format for it? And it could start with something which is an exhibition, and then you feel this material is so focusing on a specific moment in the life of this artist. And so then you start to look for the right text, and it can be a poem instead of an art historical or art critique text. So things, yes, shift in the process of thinking and talking about. And you never know at the very beginning where you end.
I was thinking, one thing that's happened for me is that I was always obsessed with magazines, so I would regularly stop at magazine stores and go through magazines like once a week, and I would go from one end to the other. A kind of visual obsession. And Instagram has replaced that. Like, once I'm on it, I can't get off. And but what's happened also, and I think it's worth bringing up, is right now, there's the Tide book, which is this, 800 images or something, right? And now I make collections on my phone, and so I categorize images, and or if I'm working on a project, and the images will go up to, I think, 20,000 images per category, or 35,000. And at one point, there's a limit to what a book can do.
Or a brain.
Yeah. Well, what I've done now is that I'll put it in a program, and it acts like a Flickr film. It's like a kind of a homage to Tony Conrad, but the images just go by, and I work on them as feature lengths, so they become features, and it can be, and I kind of at this point think I need about 40,000 images for a feature, but it's kind of there, in a way, books. And I think of them, it's kind of like it's difficult to make a book of 40,000 images, but as something on, as a digital format, and just as my brain went from magazines to Instagram, in a way, books have gone from making a fat book of images to a digital projection. And I think, and you get into this argument with people, well, I don't like to read on my, on a computer. I'd rather read a book. I like the feel of paper. And you kind of think, well, yeah, sure, but there are a lot of people, that's gonna maybe go away and books will become. So this issue of what a book has become and what it means for an artist to make a book and what it means for catalogs to exist of shows is in a very, we're in a perplexed place right now. And I just see myself at this point, I can make 50,000 image thing, and sure, I can turn it into an object and make it on a monitor or something, or a projection, but it can also go out into the world like that. And so there is something, like that paper and the subject of the paper. I still like books, don't take me wrong, but we're in a situation in which we can really say we've just moved into the digital world, and the way that operates, it's just now part of it. Like you can't separate it, and sure there's a difference, but is there an argument? I think I don't think that, for me, there's no argument. It's like, it's there, that's it.
I agree with you. I think that's why they invented artists.
Oh.
We were invented.
Well, I mean, it's always been the artist to redefine how he or she is going to transmit an idea, and you can trace it. We had when Dieter Roth decided to throw out the codex, that was a shocking move. The idea that a book didn't have pages. The horrors. And then I remember when Amazon came, everybody told me I was going to go out of business because who was going to buy a book from me? But I'm no artist, but I learned that you can't resist things. You just have to bring them in and figure out how to work with it.
Were you going to add to that?
Yeah, I agree. You just have to integrate what is there. And I think we live in a fantastic world where we have so many choices and can go different directions. What I love in the bookmaking, and then at the end having this physical book, is really that there is this whole process of thinking, rethinking, conceptualizing, and editing. And that's always the biggest challenge. You have so many images, and then you have to decide, okay, I get rid of these, and these stay. And that's also the beauty of a book which you give then to your audience, because they appreciate that there is this brain or this conversation happened to really develop that and make a suggestion and make a proposal. Because when you go in the web, there is a fantastic amount of material, but I feel very fast, very lonely and lost. And I don't want to miss that, because that's where you start with. But I appreciate to get an access to an artist's work through this editorial process, and understand something without being in this sphere of seeing everything.
I too am an Instagram addict, Paul, and I really love the idea of just, instead of editing, just collecting, and you've taken it to I'm going to think a lot about your 40,000 images, but you've taken that idea of the textlessness of Instagram. I think that in a way Facebook still had a lot of writing, and Instagram, even though it's still hashtagged, as a way of having a semantic web, but you've removed the text from not only the paper, but the text from this movie that you're making with it. And so I wanted to return to the idea of the importance of text. And the reason that I co-founded Ex Artist Books was that I actually decided to write a book instead of illustrating it or making the images. And it's called The Artist's Prison, and I had Eve Wood illustrate my work, and it was very terrifying to work in the opposite way, to be vulnerable in terms of giving another person a text to interpret, and her sort of violent, I don't even know how to describe the images. They're troubling, they're sometimes disgusting, they're nothing like what I would have imagined from my written work, and it made me love them so much. And so when I had that experience, it made me want to extend it to the best of my abilities with other artists, to say, how do we relate to text? And this is, what is the collaboration? Are you an artist who's never written before? Or do you want to illustrate a specific text? How do we, Jessica Fleischman, a wonderful graphic designer, created a world around Sylvan Oswald's play, High Winds, which is about it's a trans sleepless night in the Southwest, an adventure, and it doesn't fit in any category. Is it a LGBTQ play? Is it a work of graphic design? It doesn't fit neatly in, but yet for me, the book returns to the text. So I'm just fascinated that you have found this way of removing the text totally. How does the text as an organizing principle, have you written, I'm sorry, I don't know your I'm confessing to the whole audience.
Quite well, for me, as the obsession went to these images on my phone, the obsession to write also grew. And I think that's also related to the computer and to my telephone. I mean, the fact that I can talk on my phone and it can make a text out of what I say, and also the fact that it can screw it up. And I'm really into that. I'm into this, you could call it collaboration with my phone, but it's the abstracting that happens because of automation. And I'm really interested in processes that abstract something outside of my effort. And the telephone does that. It abstracts what I say, or if I write, it changes the words. And this, so I would say in the last 5 years, just as the accumulation of images has grown, I would say I've probably written more in the last 8 years than I did in my entire life before. So it's actually has to do, I think there's a question of physical material. It really came into question in the 60s and 70s for artists. Fluxus, whatever, Dada, conceptual, concept artists, whatever. And I think there's a question now. And also, I think technology is really moved so fast that I just made a 360 3D film. That's crazy. That's 3D, not just 360. And I think that it's moving so quick, all of it, that it's just changing our perception of what's possible. The accumulation of images it's huge, you know.
And it's overwhelming. How do you select? You have a finite space where you display books. How do you choose between projects?
How do I choose books, or how do I?
Yeah. Or what ideas? Because I actually think the books that you choose are ideas.
Well, I guess that's a good way to put it. I took a decision to do my bookstore around art of the 20th and 21st century, modern art. And so I kind of arbitrarily decided that modern art began in 1913 with the Armory show and with Duchamp and all of that. And I personally am interested in certain things. So as you know, when you come into my store, you get an awful lot of Walter Di Maria and not very much, some artists that I'm not too interested in. But I tend to collect books on subjects that are of personal interest. And any independent bookstore will do that because it's a single proprietor. It's not, in a way, it's like an artist taking a choice on a subject.
How important is the personal to you, Michaela, in what you do?
How do I
How
select?
important is the personal to you? Because you have more of an institutional, public-facing position, but indulge me with this question here this morning.
Honestly, I don't know really what this personal mean. Maybe you can help me.
It's subjective. It's
Something
good.
subjective.
My subjective passion for books or for art. Or
Yeah, and how that works through how that presents itself
well,
through your work.
I think it all comes together in my professional life. Also, I don't do that distinction, and it's. I'm not a book collector, so I have not thousands of books. So I select quite.
You
precisely
just saved yourself
styled.
a fortune.
Well, I had another approach for years, and I felt it was a burden. So I'm now more precise in what I really keep, and there are books I can also let go again. So I'm not the collector type, obviously. Others
But what
have
happens
other libraries.
Has it ever happened that you've, as a publisher, been sort of assigned a book on an artist or a subject that you were personally not interested in? How did that go forward?
That's a good question. I see every title as a challenge. If I love the art or I don't have yet access, and I learned over these years also that more you know about a piece and about an artist or the context, something happens and is developed, that you get fascinated. So it's not that I can say there is something which I don't connect to at all. So the interest and the passion for something grows with the exposure.
I have one more question for you, and then I'd like to open it to the audience, which is, could you just quickly tell me where you think ideas come from? In 5 words. No, I'm kidding. I mean, is it a process or is it a lightning strike in your...
Paul, you have
I'm looking at Paul.
Yeah. You have to use your microphone.
Oh, yeah. I was struck by lightning, but I think it's just a combination of things. Like one idea for something can grow over a very long period of time, and you kind of don't see it, and then all of a sudden there it is. And then other ones just come really quick. And Mike Kelly and I made a lot of pieces together, probably about 10 pieces. And it was funny, one time I kind of calculated probably 4 or 5 of them came from a telephone conversation on the telephone and came from a joke. Like you're in a conversation, wow, all the performance artists right now are really good looking. And isn't Matthew Barney so good looking? We should make a commune in the Hollywood Hills where everybody does Vito Acconci performances, but they're really beautiful. And then it's a joke. And then at one point you think, God, that's a good idea. So I think a lot for me there's a lot of it comes from a joke. So, but some ideas just come like that, and some take 10 years.
I think this is a great moment to open up to the audience for questions.
Yeah, I have a question for Paul. So I'm the kind of person
Do you want a microphone?
Yeah, I'm the kind of person that gets overwhelmed and I shut down when there's too many of anything. And so I was curious, when you talk about 40,000 images, like, is that the idea of images? Or is it, like, I would never be able to look at all those images. And I think, but I should look at them because they're all there. So do you see it more as an idea, or do you think people are going to look at them, or is that not the issue? I'm curious, because I'm curious about that.
Well, these collections that couldn't take three or 4 years to make, and they're almost all made on my telephone. And it's amazing how much, I think my telephone has over 120,000 images on it, which is really pretty amazing that you think that object can hold so many. But they're made over a period of time. I go through them often, looking for things. I use them like a research. But I know I tried to make the collection without the idea that I'm making a work of art. That the collection is gathering for a series of reasons related to the project. But I do know I'm making a work of art, but I don't try to make it an aesthetic decision through the thing. It's a collection. And the idea now is that they're referred to as the Flickr Films, the iPhone Flickr Films. And so they're just presented in a number of ways. One is very quick, and it takes an hour and a half to go through some 40,000 or something. They go really fast. The other one is you can slow it down. So it could take 3 years to go through 40,000. The image just comes up and goes away. What's interesting to me is you can look at the 40,000, you get through at the end of it, and you try to remember how many can you remember? And it's about 5 or 6. And it's crazy that you can look at that many images and register them. They come on quick, you can register them. But you can only remember 5 or 6. So in one way, the piece has something to do with memory of what you see, you know. One reason I made it that way is I have no copyright to the images. So they're only on in a flash of a second, and they're taken from everywhere, off the phone, off whatever I find. So I think it's not about editing, it's more of a whole. It's 40,000 images as a whole. And, you know, it's so feasible to, I think the last film we made, we shot 130,000 images. So it's just because of the camera. It can just do that. Yeah.
Hi, I was wondering, and this question's for everyone, have any of you ever fallen in love with an artist solely because of a book?
Fall in love.
Let me borrow your microphone. So, have you ever fallen in love with an art? Do you mean the physical person or their body of work? I'm just curious.
I sort of mean, like, was there an artist that you were unaware of, and then you saw their book, and you fell in love with whatever they were doing, or the art that they were making?
Through the, but you mean their work?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to be clear. I know, you could interpret the question however if you've fallen in love physically with an artist or with their body of work through, yes.
I don't know, maybe I misunderstood, but for me, the book is obviously the primary source to approach art. Because, yes, I see exhibitions, but there's only a limited number of exhibitions where I am physically, but I obviously can approach oeuvre through the book, and much more than through the internet, for example. So, yeah, I would say, yes, that's my way to really approach an artist.
I must say I haven't had the opportunity to fall in love, but the Apollinaire, the typography, certainly got my attention. I would have loved to have met him, or Brecht, or one of those guys that really knew how to use the book and the text in a sensual and subjective way.
I would say one thing, because along with that, I think that I knew of my work beginning in the 60s. I knew of Alan Capital's book, Assemblage, Environments, and Happenings. And through that, I knew of the Gutai. And through that, I knew of Yoko Ono. Well, no, not Yoko. Yoko Ono I knew through Arts and Artists magazine. And Art de Pulvera, the book, when it came out, I think affected the entire art world. And because he organized that book. So I think the position of books to affect artists, especially at that period of time, before any other way of getting to know something, was monumental. Like, I consider, I fell in love with Kudo, I think, because of Alan Capro's book.
That's called a happening. Hi, I'm Rex Weiner, and I've been an editor and publisher for many years. My new imprint, Frontera Nueva Books, launches in the fall. In my experience, there are bookmakers and there are artists, and most often they are not the same. As a publisher, Michaela, how do you make that distinction to an artist?
Well, we start talking. We have conversations about, and it's pretty fast clear where an artist wants to be involved. And there are, as you say, there are artists who are very close to what's happening and how a book is developed and also produced, and others are not so much interested. And I think that's, for me, absolutely fine. And we also did an artist book, and it started as a proposal to the artist, and she was happy with it. And it works as an artist book because it has this really immediacy of an impact to the audience, but it's not even shaped by her, by this artist, which I don't want to name now, but I think there are really different ways to approach. And it's not a problem if an artist does not want to be involved. I think it's important that at the end of this whole process, the artist is satisfied and feels that his or her work is represented in an appropriate way. So for me, the authority at the end is always the artist. As far as, well, it does not matter how far he or her is involved.
Can I add? I know the question was directed at you, but I have an anecdote, which is I'm doing Ex-Artist Books, we're doing a book with Etel Adnan and the filmmaker Lynn Marie Kirby, gathering years of their textual exchanges and misinterpretations. And we were having a meeting with Lynn on Skype and the curator, Jordan Stein from the Cadist. And I said, you know, Lynn, I'm not really a publisher. And she went, okay. And then Jordan said, and I'm not really a curator. And she kind of got this panicky look, but I loved that idea that we were going to enter into making a book without the institutional roles being as clear. And it's this, again, sort of wanting to finish up on the note we began, which for me, artist books are places to play. And so, unless anyone has any more questions, I think we have one more question. But can we do two more? Two more, front row ladies.
This is actually a question for you. The story that you told about the person that wrote to you that saw your book and decided not to commit suicide. I had a visceral reaction to that. I'm just wondering how, as the creator of this work, that impacted somebody that you didn't know, may never meet. I mean, to me, that's kind of the poetic manifestation of quantum entanglement almost, that you have this effect on somebody.
I was hoping someone was going to bring up quantum entanglement at this panel. Check. We're done. It is, you know, I think that this idea of mystery, of where, for me, the question of, I've had ideas simmering on the back burner, and the lightning bolt of just receiving out of nowhere, sort of almost like a code to translate through making. It is always such an honor to be received. And I worked with the great French playwright and philosopher Hélène Cixous, and she talked about creativity as being a telepathic act. And I thought about telepathy being something that you had to share in the moment. But she gave a definition, which was, the telepathic act is, I will write a text and I'll send it into the world. And the person who is meant to receive it, that's the telepathy. And so that idea of being received over time by someone who needed or wanted your message, it gives me the chills to think about it. So it's part of the mystery and the magic of making things, is that we are sending them off. There are messages in a bottle, but we don't know who's going to receive them. So we have one last question, and it will be you here in the front row, because you've been very patient. Yeah.
Okay, first, I appreciate this meeting because I'm doing the painting, sculpturing, and writing the story. And because each of my artwork has a story to tell. Now I've become worried, if my writing is not as good as my art, will they be damaging my publishing my book? Or it doesn't matter, I'll be judged a different way? So, because I do going to make film out of my sculpture and artwork, because I do the big pieces, 20 by 14 feet. There's no gallery and no museum can present, but it will present in the film. So I decided to use a film to talk about my art. And then talk about comedy, funnies about book title. I bought a book called Let's Eat. And when I saw the title, I said, let's eat what? Thai food, Italian food, Chinese food. In LA, we are in a multi-culture. You know, we have all different kind of food available everywhere in the market, in the restaurant. So I bought that book because of the title, but not because of the recipe.
Fantastic. The importance of titles. I thought we had one last question, and then really, we're going to wrap it up. Nope. Not. Oh, yes.
Maybe for the publishers in the group, has anyone done a sort of digital physical combo book. When you were talking, when Paul was talking about the internet, like just accepting digital, I was like, but wait, I do need to hold things and look at things. I also need to change the angle of view when I look at things, even books, And so I was just curious. I started to picture this structure that could download the, images or new text onto it, like some sort of built thing. I was just curious, are you doing anything like that? Do you understand what my question is?
It's a question for me?
For publishers, like, are you creating object books that take the digital world into them?
Yeah, thank you. I was waiting for this question, obviously. Since I guess at least 10 years, we always circle around this thing, the physical book, and then we praise the paper and the touch and the binding. And yes, that's really something we love as physical beings. And but on the other hand, there are all these new technologies, and Paul just mentioned how he is developing the work and 3D and 360 degree, and I'm really fascinated what's happening in the artist studios and how traditional I'm working in my office, honestly. There are these moments where we get involved, or where we see that there are options, how you can also extend the physical book into three-dimensional images. So there are apps you can download and develop. We haven't yet done it in our own practice, since the artists we work with are not really asking for it. So that was interesting for me also, and that would be an additional question for Paul, since the book object, even if you see it as a sculpture, is in its making. It's a book, it's printed, binded, but in your artistic work, you develop so different technologies, or you use them and you develop them further. So how does this come together? Are you thinking about extending the practice of bookmaking also in the digital?
Yes.
I think that Doug Aiken is working on that too, trying to make his work sort of presented in a non-book format. And of course you did that big book, Paul, with the records in it.
We just did a book with George Herms, and we didn't publish his River book, but I know that has a CD, DVD in the back of his opera. But one thing that we haven't moved into the digital, I think it's too complex for us, but of our first 4 books, 3 were performances. And so that idea of putting the book into another format, we like to get people together through the reading, performative aspects of a book. And so it's this idea of what is real, and how can the book interface with our imaginations and bring it into the real.
I mean, we all kind of know that the digital world has changed distribution of practically everything, from art to film to music to books. So, you kind of think, well, obviously, making a book, magazines are now digital all the time. We subscribe to them. I mean, it's here. It's not a matter of when it comes. It's already past us. So we attach ourselves to books for reasons, but the digital world has already consumed all those issues. Like there's no issue anymore.
You already said that one doesn't preclude the other.
Yeah.
So on that wonderful note, thank you all for being here with us this morning. Thank you.